single mom Wilda Gadd has always put family first.
It was a perfect country life with all your family right there around you.
So when she finally meets a man who shares her values, she's sure he's the one.
Being the way it was with my kids, our whole relationship just kind of blossomed.
But their marriage will be haunted by the mystery surrounding his family.
There was a lot of rumors. There's no way she would have walked off and left that child.
Sam never showed up, never heard from him.
Sam didn't never take no vacations.
Sam Thomas is really missing. We've got a problem. Both of them were murdered. His body was found without his head. Now they're also realizing that the kids are missing.
And it made me sick to my stomach.
To stop a killing streak, Wilda has to put her own life at risk.
My mom is the only living witness.
If he found out that she turned on him, she'd have been as dead as the rest of them.
I grew up out in the country. Chickamauga, Georgia's about 10 miles outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's a little small country town.
From the youngest age, family is everything to Wilda Gadd.
My grandfather owns several acres, so we grew up with more family for neighbors than anything else, and we were able to roam the streets and woods and fields without any harm to come to us.
Wilda is my sister. We had a pretty much normal childhood as far as getting out playing and grandparents down the street. Wilda was very smart. She still is. Book smart, common sense smart. Her whole dream in life was to be a doctor.
Shortly after I finished high school, I actually went to college. I was a pre-med major. I let a high school sweetheart get in my way, so I did drop out of college for a while. And I did join the United States Air Force in '83. Due to a heart condition, I was shortly discharged on medical. I then married my first husband on New Year's Day in '84.
Her whole life she wanted children. They had a little boy, which was Bradley, and they had a daughter.
I was actually born in Okinawa, Japan, on Kadena Air Base. My dad was an MP with the Air Force.
Closer to the end of our stay there, my husband's mentality changed. Our marriage ended in '88. And around that time, me and my kids returned to Chickamauga. When we did get back to Georgia, we were all kind of hanging out at my grandparents' house, and Sam was there.
Sam was Mom's brother. He's probably our favorite uncle. We always stood outside peeking out to see when Sam was coming, you know, up the drive. It was like Santa Claus coming.
Sam Thomas had been at all the family dinners with his wife Betty and stepson Howard when Wilda and Regina were growing up.
About the time I was in middle school, I learned that Sam and Betty had split up. To me as a kid, it was shocking to find out that her and Howard were no longer going to be part of our family.
And now, it's like old times when Howard returns to visit as an adult.
Wilda, she thought he was charming. She thought he was handsome.
He seemed to be a fun-loving guy. He was always laughing and cutting up.
Like Wilda, Howard is navigating the new challenges of being a single parent.
Howard had a child that he was taking care of by himself, Kelly.
She was 4 or 5 years old. She was Howard's daughter by his first wife, Debbie Weinecker.
This is just what I know of the story. Debbie ran off and left and abandoned the child.
You know, it was just a heartbreaking situation. The love of his life just walked off and left him for no reason, don't know whether she's dead or alive, and now he's got a child that he doesn't know how to explain what's happened to her mom. One of the things that really attracted me to Howard was the fact he wanted to be a family man.
Howard was such a loving, kind, gentle person, and knowing that Sam helped raise him, I think she felt safe.
Wilda and her kids are about to head off on a Disneyland vacation. The timing couldn't be better.
Kelly was having such a good time with my kids that I was approached by Howard and Sam about maybe her going with me to Disney. We took her with us. Watching Kelly interact with my kids, you wouldn't have known that they were not true brother and sister. Once our visit was over at Disney, Howard's intentions originally was to come out there and he was going to take Kelly back to Chattanooga with him. But she kind of clung to me and got attached to me. I wanted to take her and, kind of be that step in for her as long as I could.
The next step seems only logical to Howard and Wilda. Join forces as two single parents, raising their children together.
All of us, Howard, Kelly, my kids, we all moved in together. And so me and Howard, we started more as friends. I don't exactly remember the moment it became romantic. We just kind of gravitated towards each other. I knew with my uncles, helping upbring him, that he was a decent guy. It just kind of blossomed. It was what I wanted.
They just seemed to bond real quickly. It seemed to go real fast.
He was very cuddly. No matter where you were at, he made you feel loved and wanted. It seemed like he was the perfect person to fit in with the family and wanted to be with that family.
But there are those who would break this happy family up, and they've got lawyers.
I was beginning to learn more about Howard's custody battle at the time. The court battle started after Debbie disappeared. Her sister and her mother filed for custody of Kelly. Howard got Debbie pregnant when she was married to someone else. So with Howard not having his name on Kelly's birth certificate, he was not considered her legitimate father. Their view was Howard was the bad guy. Howard broke up the marriage. The judge pretty much made the decision to remove Kelly from Howard's custody without ever hearing Howard's side of the story. Our whole family, felt for Howard and felt that he was being done wrong by the justice system in Bradley County.
Wilda doesn't have the knowledge or training to take on a court battle, at least not yet.
The law always interested me, so I returned to junior college to study paralegal.
She was always smiling and happy and going along. But there was a lot of rumors. I had heard rumors that Howard had killed Debbie Winiger and buried her in the basement. And then I had heard other rumors that he had killed her and hauled her off because supposedly there's no way she would have walked off and left that child. So I don't know.
The rumors had started when Debbie Winiger went missing in the fall of '87, just a few months before Wilda and Howard re-met.
Debbie's family reported her missing in fall of 1987. When they tried to talk with her, and she was never available to talk. You haven't talked to your sister in over a month because she's been sick or a headache or couldn't come to the phone. They got highly suspicious, and that's when Howard told them that she had left. And so Debbie's family felt like he had done something with her.
He had filed to get divorced from Debbie, and it stayed hung up in courts because she was still considered a missing person, and he was listed as a person of interest. I felt really bad for Howard because from the side that I was hearing, he was totally in the right.
After months of researching legal options, Wilda and Howard are able to put the malicious rumors to rest when Debbie supposedly shows up at Howard's lawyer's office.
His receptionist said the girl looked like Debbie, brought the papers in here and says, "Here, I'm signed them, I want a divorce." And there was also a document signed giving Howard the custody of Kelly.
It's hard to imagine a happier ending to all Wilda's worries.
That sounded great to me. Debbie's back, his supposedly dead ex-wife. Here she is, she showed up, she's alive, she's not dead.
The fact is, it's only the beginning of Wilda's nightmare. The worst is yet to come.
It's just sometimes just the gut feeling you get about a person, something's not right.
It became a mission in my mind to solve this case. And I wish that I could have, because 3 people would still be alive today.
Wilda Gadd and Howard Hawk Willis are thrilled to learn that Howard's wife has reappeared at Howard's lawyer's office, just long enough to serve divorce papers. Debbie looks to be alive and well, despite all of her family's unproven accusations.
It was a relief. Legal battles would be over.
But Howard's lawyer is not so certain.
The lawyer asked about it because the signature didn't match him they had on file. The lawyer questioned it being true. He made the comment that maybe someone had come in there portraying to be Debbie. He wasn't going to put a document that he was sure was falsified in courts. Of course, Howard denied knowing anything about it to the lawyer. I asked Howard what he knew. Finally, Howard admitted he had someone dress up like Debbie and take the divorce papers to Willis Jackson's office. So he knew in Oklahoma who matched her description, who was willing to go in there and portray to be Debbie so he could get his divorce without any more issues. Knowing that he was willing to have someone impersonate his ex-wife kind of was off-nerving. It kind of throws up red flags, but he smooths it out. He was so charming and smooth talking, you didn't want to think he was wrong. I really wanted to believe that Howard was 100% truthful.
Once Howard is caught in one lie, everything starts unraveling. After Debbie went missing 2 years earlier, custody of her and Howard's daughter had been granted to Debbie's family, not to Howard.
I honestly didn't know that Howard had lost custody, but apparently didn't have custody, and he was wanted for kidnapping. I learned Howard was arrested for federal kidnapping actually on the news.
Wilda and Sam come to Howard's rescue.
He walked in the courtroom, we signed bond papers and walked back out. But in the meantime, Kelly was placed in the custody of her aunt, Gertrude Lark. At the time, to realize a grandmother and an aunt would want to take the child away from her only parent that she knew was horrifying. Kelly is in Virginia, away from the one person that was her solid support for all the years.
It's the beginning of a long, dark chapter for Howard and Wilda. But during that time, they do get a little good news.
Finally, Howard was granted a divorce from Debbie on irreconcilable differences and abandonment.
Howard is once again an eligible bachelor.
We just, on the spur of the moment, walked into a judge's chamber and got married.
You can really see what Wilda saw in him, a charming, handsome man who loved children. He loved her. He was good to her.
We went out and had a nice dinner. We spent one night away, and then we returned home. Being husband and wife, it kind of gave me some relief knowing that, we still had our relationship no matter what happened.
There is still one downside to Wilda's married life, and that's Howard's mother, Betty, who takes a strong dislike to her new daughter-in-law because she is the niece of her ex-husband, Sam.
Betty, his mother, always hated me. She didn't want me around, so there was always a conflict of struggle there.
Betty Willis did threaten her daughter-in-law, Wilda, several times. She threatened to shoot her with a long gun at some point. She definitely threatened to cut her up into pieces.
We like to call her crazy, but she was evil. It's not just me. She was against Howard being involved with anybody other than doing what she wanted when she wanted to.
Wilda and Howard never stopped their fight to win Kelly back. And finally, Wilda's ongoing law studies pay off when she files charges against the judge in Howard's custody case.
The judge admitted to having ex parte hearings, which means he was meeting one-on-one with a lawyer, not with the whole group of lawyers and making decisions. And they forced him to recuse himself from Howard's case.
And after 2 long years of legal battles, a DNA test yields a breakthrough. It proves with 99% certainty Howard is Kelly's natural father.
So Howard was able to regain custody of Kelly because we were able to get him recognized as her father. That was one of the best victories we honestly had against Bradley County courts. By then the kids were almost middle school. We were given custody of Kelly the first part of December. and we drove to Virginia to pick her up on Christmas Eve and bring her home. Sam was with us. It made for a great Christmas. It was like a dream come true. I finally had my happy ever after. After we got custody of Kelly, we decided that we wanted to build our own house. We didn't pick a plan out of a book and hand it to a contractor and say, do it. The house was 100% built out of love.
But now they have to pay for the mortgage.
Howard had been a long-haul truck driver prior to us getting together years back. So he decided the best way, to make money, he was wanting to drive an 18-wheeler. So Sam and me went in halves and bought an 18-wheeler. We titled it SH&W Trucking, Sam, Howard, and Wilda. We had an operating authority, which meant I could book our loads. I would reach out to different companies to see if they had loads in our area. I did that for several years, and then Howard come across a guy in Brownsville, Texas. Howard started letting this guy book his loads to and from wherever he chose to go. He was making regular trips from Mexico to New York, hauling citrus. When Howard started doing long hauls all the time, wanting to be gone more than he was home, things changed. Family wasn't as important to him as him going and making money or doing whatever he was doing.
In fact, Howard's plans for a nest egg are about to explode spectacularly.
When the police first called me and told me that they had found our truck, it's been abandoned on a side road, it's been here overnight. And they said, who was driving? I said, Howard Willis, he's my husband, where is he? And they said, the truck's been sitting here, we've not seen anybody. And they wanted to know if I knew where he was. So I'm in shock, not knowing what's going on. I have no way of calling Howard because cell phones then were limited. And they questioned me. I really feel they were trying to see if I knew what was in the truck. My first thing is what happened to my husband? Where's my truck? And where is Howard?
Police in New York State have found SH&W's 18-wheeler, apparently abandoned, with Howard's whereabouts unknown.
Howard calls me, and he tells me he's at a motel, and I ask him where the truck is. They took it to unload it. I'm waiting on them to bring it back. I called him out on it. I said, no, the police have your truck. And so he starts kind of backpedaling like, the guy picked the truck up. He was supposed to be bringing it back. It should be here any minute. There's no way. So between the police calling and Howard calling, I'm kind of in limbo of who am I believing. Finally, the police asked me if they could search my truck. Of course, you can search my truck.
All Wilda thinks they'll find is citrus fruits, but that's not the case.
Howard hauled approximately 700 kilos of cocaine into the state of New York. That really blew my mind. I was shocked because that's not something I would have ever thought he would have done. Why on earth would you put everything we had at risk for a drug charge?
Knowing he has no option, Howard turns himself in.
And he's charged with one of the largest pure cocaine hauls into the United States. Once we found out there were drugs on the truck, Sam had a hard time believing that Howard didn't know it. What are you doing hauling drugs? What did you get involved in? You are totally against drugs, but yet you're going to haul cocaine in to the United States that even your own kids could get a hold of. But Howard's able to convince everybody that he wasn't really a part of it and that he don't know what happened. And in all honesty, to think back, he never gave us a satisfactory answer.
Wilda is livid about Howard's situation, but her mother-in-law is even angrier. And she blames Wilda for Howard's arrest.
Betty starts sending death threats to us, start talking about how I'd be shot long range and I'd be chopped up in little pieces where you couldn't identify me. So between the drug charges and Betty threatening us, it's a lot. New York DEA offered a closed deal if he testified and gave names of where the cocaine come from, that he would just receive parole. You give us the information, you get 20 years probation and walk. Howard turned on a gentleman named Kenneth Adams. Supposedly he's the one that actually arranged the deal with Howard to haul the drugs. I believe Sam had the bond posted for him. I think the bond was $200,000. Sam believed in Howard. No matter what Howard did wrong, Sam always looked for the best in Howard.
Sam thought Howard was a good son, but he wasn't. He may have been a good son to his mother. That's another story.
After Howard posts bail and comes home, he realizes his world is kind of closing in on him.
So now the truck is gone. Howard's home. At the time, I'm the only one working. It's wearing on me because I'm doing it all. We're still acting husband and wife to an extent, but there's a great distance between us.
Things really went sour between my mom and Howard when Kelly started going a little teenage crazy.
I know that Wilda had a lot of struggles with her, and I don't think Howard backed Wilda.
In fact, Howard is openly defiant of Wilda and starts acting like a teenager himself. Wilda arrives home from work to discover a surprising scene.
I start coming home with kids in my family room and in my dining room. Boys and girls, sleeping bags, blankets, beds, whatever, just wall to wall with kids. Howard's story was, I'm trying to get along with Kelly. She's a teenager. I'm trying to let her have some space and have her friends over. I questioned him about it, and Howard admitted the kids were drinking. It was very hurtful because that was against everything we believed. I said, that's not appropriate. This doesn't happen again. New Year's Eve, I got off at midnight. My two children, they told me Howard and Kelly went out with some of Kelly's friends. So Howard tells me that him and the kids were out later than they meant to, and they had got a room. And so he decided to stay in the motel with, I think there was 8 teenagers at least. I wondered if there was more of a sexual relationship with some of the teenage girls. It's not normal. And it really, that's what broke my marriage. The only choice I could make was for me and Howard to split up and me protect what I had the most, my kids.
Wilda gets an apartment, and she works and takes care of her kids.
I walked away from the house because I knew I couldn't afford the mortgage by myself at that point.
And I do know that she cried a lot. It really broke her heart.
Once I moved out of the house, most of his group moved into the house and was staying there.
But Howard is not working and can't make the mortgage payments. He and the teens are essentially squatters, intent on partying.
It's like he had to be the 16-year-old himself and fit with the 16-year-olds. Kelly had mentioned that her daddy was the one buying the beer. He was the one buying the drugs. And he was letting them use it. He said he would rather them use it at home than be on the streets. Eventually, the bank had foreclosed on the house, so he was forced to move out of the house we had built. Him and the kids all moved to a house in Rossville, late July, 1st of August. So he's living up there with them. He was getting money somehow to pay for their place. I'm assuming Betty was paying for it. In August of 2002, Howard called me. He said, I'm just leaving the wedding chapel. Kelly got married and Adam and Samantha got married. And I'm like,
Adam Crismer, Samantha Lemming Crismer, and Kelly's new husband, Brandon, are all 16 and 17-year-olds.
A grown man taking 2 teenaged couples to get married. Why? Why would he do that?
I don't know whether he was trying to keep them under his thumb. That's the only thing I can think of. It was a way to keep them close.
It did appear that Howard controlled these kids. When Howard and me first split up, Sam kind of had faded a little bit out of our life because he thought it was all me. So Sam didn't realize that it was actually Howard encouraging this and it was going on. But Sam himself actually went to the house one day and saw for himself the house was piled up with a bunch of teenagers in Howard. Sam very much voiced his opinion to Howard that he did not approve of it.
This is when Sam finally washes his hands of the stepson he had once doted on.
Sam started coming back around, and he had pretty much washed his hands of Howard. Sam was hurt. Kelly was Sam's really first grandchild. Kelly meant everything to him, and he, always thought Howard would do right. Howard and me divorced July of 2002. It's about me and my kids now, and them having a relationship with Sam that they still deserve, because that is their grandfather. Sam was very important. I mean, he was there through a lot of things that went on with my grandparents, and then when Howard started having issues, he was there for Howard. And then when Howard and me split up, he was still there for me and my kids, until one day he wasn't. In September, my mom was having to have surgery, so Sam was going to come down and help take care of the cattle. He never showed up, never heard from him.
And that's not Sam. He was always very prompt. If he called and said, I'm going to be there at 9, he's going to be there at 9. Big red flag. Yeah, big red flag. Something wasn't right.
We called periodically on that day, trying to reach him. Hey, give me a call back. So by Monday, after not hearing from him for several days, I decided to drive up there. Howard said he would go with me. It scared me. That was the first time I had honestly been scared to death of what else I was going to learn.
And what Wilda is about to learn will change her life forever.
Something happened in that house.
She was crying, just hysterical crying. And we were like, why would he do that? He's not capable of doing that. There's no way.
Wilda Gadd is concerned when her Uncle Sam Thomas stops answering his phone. Although Wilda and Howard are still estranged, she asks him to come with her to check on Sam.
We walk around the outside of the house. The house is locked, tried to look in the windows. My mom and my uncle, we had all talked, and they said, whatever you have to do, enter the house. So I use a credit card and entered the house.
They found some pamphlets where he had been looking about taking a trip, it looked like.
And then Howard, he goes, oh, I forgot to tell you, Sam told me, the first of the month, he was going to buy a camper and he was going to be out of town a while.
Well, Sam didn't never take no trips. Only thing he did was drive a truck. He wasn't taking no trip, vacations. So I believe those were posed.
The overnight bag he always carried, we didn't see it, it was gone. We saw his medicine in the cabinet. He had some high blood pressure and his carotid arteries were partially blocked. So that didn't make sense because Sam took care of himself. So even though the truck's gone, we're still concerned, maybe something's happened. My mom and my uncle drive to Bradley County and file a missing person. And Bradley County told him he was 73 years old, he could go and come as he pleases. Bradley County didn't take us seriously. We're going on a second week and no contact. And that's definitely not Sam.
Now, with more family and Sam's friends from church, Wilda mounts an intensive search.
We walked my uncle's farmland. We weren't even 5 feet apart, we walked it. We searched the chicken houses. There were some small, grain silos. I mean, if we could move it, we moved it and turned it upside down. We searched the house again, where then we found his overnight bag had been stuffed under stuff. So what he normally carried that we thought was gone is there. One of his church members says, hey, that's the wrong chair. That chair belongs there. There's a chair missing.
The chair that was in the house, Sam's had it sitting in a certain spot, and you could see the marks on the carpet, where he had it at. And when we moved it back, and there was a stain on the floor, like a big stain, like a blood stain.
We found a really good picture of Sam and had flyers made up to put on cars or in buildings to look for Sam ourselves.
We had hundreds of flyers made. Going to restaurants, going to stores. We were just basically hoping each day that we'd hear something.
Wilda decides she's going to call a psychic in. Well, I don't believe in psychics, never have. But he comes in and he tells her that Sam is hunting for his arms. He says he can't find his arms.
Sam's truck's missing. I have a cousin that starts getting on the phone too. She locates Sam's truck at Chattanooga Airport.
But none of the airlines have any record of a Sam Thomas flying anywhere.
So the brochures were in the house, and the truck was left at the Chattanooga Airport. We figured that was like a decoy.
One of the family members talked to the parking lot guard, and he said, yeah, I remember when that truck come in. He said a gentleman drove the truck in, and he got in a blue Jeep with 2 kids, and they drove back out.
More worried than ever, Sam's brother decides to follow the money.
My uncle managed to get a hold of credit card statements, which showed his credit card being used at midnight on the 5th. My uncle contacted the local Walmart, and somehow my uncle managed to review the tapes.
And what they find is devastating in its implications.
They showed Howard and Adam Crismer using my uncle's credit cards.
17-year-old Adam Crismer, one of Howard's entourage, the one who recently married his 16-year-old girlfriend, Samantha.
Finally, the police were in it enough between the tapes and the truck that they were ready to talk to Howard.
The Bradley County Sheriff called him in for an interview on October 4th.
Howard promises to come in and meet.
He did not show up on October 4th. At the last minute, he called and asked for the interview to be moved to October 8th. And in between October 4th and October 8th, a lot of terrible things happened.
A few days later, I get a letter in the mail saying that Adam, and I can't remember, there's several names in the letter, were setting Howard up for murder. And the letter was from Samantha Crismer.
Wilda turns the letter over to the police, and now they take an active interest in Sam's disappearance.
And they wanted to talk to Adam and Samantha both, because it was enough then to know something was wrong.
They can't find Samantha or Adam, but they do find Howard.
He does eventually come into the sheriff's office for the October 8th interview, and he's held.
Howard was being arraigned on federal charges because he was caught using Sam's credit card, so that was a violation of his parole.
Now he is stuck in jail and about to make a bunch of mistakes.
Howard is allowed phone calls, which the authorities monitor. One of the calls is to his mother, Betty.
Betty Willis is talking to him, and they're trying to use code words. And he's saying, you need to move that furniture. She mentions a storage unit. She can't even fully get the sentence out. And he was like, shut up. But she said just enough that the police caught it, and they were like, oh. So the police started calling around different storage units, and they found that Betty Willis had rented a unit in Johnson City, Tennessee. Basically, they could tell from the outside of the storage unit that it was really bad. There is the smell of death.
The Johnson City Sheriff's Office have found human remains in Betty Willis's storage locker, but news of their discovery has been kept from the media. Betty doesn't know, Howard doesn't know, and Wilda doesn't know a thing.
The Johnson City Police Department pretty much told me I had to come up there and talk to them if I wanted not to be associated or involved in what was going on.
The detectives are undecided as to whether Wilda's a possible witness or a suspect, so they tell her as little as possible.
They said, we need you to do us a favor. They fix it where I can go in the jail to see Howard.
Wilda agreed to wear a wire to go visit Howard in jail.
When Wilda tells Howard she's coming, he has a surprising request.
He said, I need you to bring a tape recorder, a notepad, and a pencil. He actually requested himself being taped. I think he figured he could tell me he needed certain things done and I would have a tape recording of it. And that way I could follow exactly what he wanted done without missing a step.
Howard is unaware that Wilda is cooperating with the police.
So they wire me up. We go over to the jail. I have the wire on. The tape recorder that Howard asked me to bring was turned on. They brought Howard in, and as soon as he hits the door, he says, "You're too late." He said, "I blew their brains out." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I blew their brains out." And it's not making sense.
The detectives know exactly who Howard is talking about because of what they discovered inside Betty's storage locker.
Okay, this is the entrance. Locker number 47, approaching the locker. This is the raw video, nothing has been removed.
They found two 50-gallon storage containers. Inside were the bodies of Adam and Samantha Christmer.
Medical camera people are now moving on the left. There's definitely, they said, body in the second container as well.
Adam had been dismembered.
There's definitely a body underneath all that.
His head was missing, his hands were missing.
He proceeds to tell me that he shot the kids.
Adam's yeah, I blew the brains out.
And that he dismembered Adam because that's what Adam did to Sam.
What did you cut? Adam, what did you cut? The dead man.
He said, "I know the family would want me to do the same thing to them as they did to Sam."
Detectives know about Adam and Samantha. They've not seen any proof Uncle Sam is dead. Wilda wants to believe he is still alive, but has a sick feeling that he's not.
And so I asked him then to give me details, where I can find Sam's body. And he gives me 4 or 5 locations. But, Howard keeps talking about, "Don't worry about Sam. Y'all got to help me." They arrested him just minutes later. The police department asked me to make one more phone call that night. We went to a payphone across from the jail, and we called Howard's Aunt Marie Holmes and Betty. They said, let them know what happened. So I tell Marie and Betty that Howard told me that he killed the kids. And the first words out of Marie and Betty is, "Destroy the tape." Within minutes, Betty and Marie were arrested for asking me to tamper with evidence. I continued to see Howard many times because I wanted to know where to find Sam. Howard was still talking to me even though he knew that his confession to me got him arrested. Finally, he told me to go back down the road from the fire department, that there would be a mobile home set not way off the road with a carport. Within less than 30 minutes, they had found Sam's body. I called my family so that we could all meet and I could tell them that my uncle was gone. Because we still hoped he was alive.
She told us all that Howard had killed Sam. We couldn't even shed a tear. We would just, no, there's no way. They've got this messed up. There is no way. Howard was out there searching with us. Why would he do that?
After almost a decade of delays, Howard goes to trial for the murders of Adam and Samantha Christmer, the first of his victims to be located.
They played the tape recording that I had made in the jail that night, and within less than 2 days, they came back with a guilty verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Howard Hawk Willis, guilty of first-degree murder.
And he was given a death sentence on both kids.
Howard's death sentence for killing Adam and Samantha means Sam's murder case will probably never go to trial. As for Howard's first wife, Debbie, hers is still officially a missing persons case.
I just couldn't help but think that if we could have brought him to justice earlier, got the investigation concluded on Debbie, 3 people probably alive today. But it never got solved. And so these people had to suffer too.
I think Betty should have been convicted of murder right along beside Howard.
Betty and her sister Marie both die before they can be tried for their involvement. That is, if Betty died.
You know, there was rumors Betty had passed away in a motel in Oklahoma. I honestly don't believe it, Betty died.
She had a lot of police friends and things like that that would help her. Nobody seemed to see her in a casket. Nobody's seen her dead. Nobody.
It has been quite a journey to a world I never dreamed I'd be involved in. I really share my story because there's got to be more people that probably are living the same life I lived, that deny all the signs they see, because you really don't want to think the person that you've built a life with, that's a parent to your kids, or that you're in love with, could ever do so much behind your back. Because the bottom line is, no matter how well you know them, you don't know who they are. I couldn't let Howard destroy my life totally, because then if I did, he won. Once Howard was convicted and sentenced, then it kind of gave me permission to move on with my life. I did marry again, and I love my husband to death today. Yeah, I still deal with the after effects of what Howard did, and after effects of still not knowing the truth about Sam. But I can't dwell on the past. I've got to move on. I've got a family. I've got grandkids. So now we get to spoil our grandkids together. And that's what my life's about now.
The road into Chickamauga, Georgia, doesn't rush to meet you. It stretches out slowly, like a long breath held between rolling fields and quiet woods, where time feels less like a ticking clock and more like a habit passed down through generations. On certain mornings, when the mist still clings low to the ground and the air carries the faint scent of damp earth and hay, the place feels untouched, safe, even. The kind of place where doors are left unlocked, where children run barefoot through open yards, and where everyone knows not just your name, but your story. It was in this quiet pocket of the world that Wilda Gadd built her life. From the outside, it looked like something close to perfect. A single mother who had fought her way through hardship and still managed to create a home filled with warmth, laughter, and stability for her children. She had known struggle, yes, but she had also known resilience. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but shows up every morning, making breakfast, packing lunches, holding everything together when no one else sees the cracks. And for a long time, that was enough. But life has a way of shifting, sometimes so gently you don't notice it at first. A new face appears. A familiar name resurfaces. A connection that once belonged to childhood suddenly takes on a different shape, a different meaning. Howard. He didn't arrive like a storm. There was no thunder, no warning. If anything, he came like comfort, like something known, something safe. He had been part of the extended family's orbit for years, tied in through marriages and shared histories, the kind of presence that never quite disappears, even when time passes. By the time Wilda saw him again as an adult, he wasn't just a memory. He was a man navigating his own struggles, raising a young daughter on his own, carrying a story that, on the surface, seemed heartbreaking in all the right ways. A woman he loved had vanished. A child left behind without answers. A father doing his best. It was a narrative that made sense. Too much sense. And maybe that was the first clue. But clues, in real life, don't come with labels. They don't announce themselves as warnings. They hide inside small details, tucked into moments that feel insignificant at the time. A hesitation in a story. A glance that lingers a second too long. A version of the truth that shifts, just slightly, depending on who's listening. At first, none of that mattered. What mattered was how he made her feel. Seen. Understood. Needed. In a life that had demanded so much strength from her, Howard offered something different. He was attentive, affectionate, almost effortlessly charming. He laughed easily, spoke with warmth, and seemed to slip into her world as though he had always belonged there. More importantly, he connected with her children, and they connected with him. That, more than anything, built the foundation. Because when you're a parent, love isn't just about you. It's about who stands beside your children, who earns their trust, who becomes part of their everyday world. And Howard did that quickly. Naturally. Or at least, it seemed that way. Their lives began to intertwine in ways that felt organic, inevitable. What started as companionship, two single parents sharing the weight of responsibility, gradually deepened into something more intimate. There wasn't a single moment where everything changed. No grand declaration, just a quiet progression, like two paths slowly merging into one. And for a while, it worked. The children played together like siblings. Laughter filled the house in overlapping waves. There were dinners, shared routines, small traditions forming without effort. It was the kind of life people spend years trying to build, a blended family that didn't feel forced but natural. It felt right, too right, because behind that warmth, behind the easy smiles and the sense of belonging, something else was already taking shape. Something quieter, harder to define. A tension that didn't have a clear source yet, but lingered just beneath the surface, like a shadow that only appears when the light hits at a certain angle. It started with whispers. Not loud enough to demand attention. Not clear enough to confirm. Just fragments, things said in passing, stories that didn't quite align, rumors that seemed too dark, too extreme to be true. About a woman. Debbie. Howard's past wasn't just complicated, it was incomplete. The woman who had once been central to his life, the mother of his child, hadn't simply left in the way he described. At least, that's what people said. They said she had disappeared. They said there were questions that had never been answered. They said things that, if taken seriously, would have changed everything. But here's the thing about rumors. They're easy to dismiss when they don't fit the reality you're living. When the person in front of you doesn't match the image being painted by others. When your own experiences contradict the narrative being whispered behind closed doors. Wilda heard those rumors. Of course she did. In a small town, nothing stays hidden for long. Stories travel faster than facts, shaped and reshaped with every telling. And yet, when she looked at Howard, when she saw the way he interacted with her children, the way he spoke, the way he seemed to care, it didn't add up. It couldn't. Because the man she knew didn't feel dangerous. He didn't feel capable of the things people hinted at. He felt human. Flawed, maybe. Complicated, certainly. But not monstrous. And so she did what most people would do. She chose to believe what she could see, what she could feel, not what others claimed. But belief, especially when built on emotion, can be fragile. It can bend under pressure, crack under the weight of new information. And sometimes, it holds just long enough for the truth to settle in, quietly, patiently, before everything begins to unravel. Because the truth doesn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes in pieces. A lie uncovered here. A detail that doesn't match there. A moment where the mask slips, just enough for something darker to show through. And when that happens, when the version of reality you've built starts to fracture, the question isn't just what is true. It's how long it's been true. How much of it you missed. How much of it you chose not to see. For Wilda, that realization wouldn't come immediately. It would take time. It would take loss. And it would take a series of events so disturbing, so far removed from the life she thought she was living, that by the time the full picture came into focus, it would already be too late. Because somewhere between the quiet roads of Chickamauga and the life she was trying to build, a story was unfolding, one that didn't belong to love or family or second chances. It belonged to something else entirely. Something that had been there from the very beginning. Waiting. Chickamauga, Georgia is the kind of place where history doesn't just live in books. It lingers in the soil, in the wooden porches that creak under familiar footsteps, in the way neighbors greet each other without hesitation because they've known each other for decades. It sits just a short drive from Chattanooga, Tennessee, but it might as well be a world apart. Here, life moves slower. Not out of laziness, but out of tradition. Out of a quiet understanding that not Everything needs to be rushed. For Wilda Gadd, this wasn't just a place on a map. It was home in the deepest sense of the word. She grew up surrounded by family, not in the abstract way people often describe, but physically, tangibly. Land passed down through generations meant that relatives weren't scattered across cities. They were just down the road, across the field, sometimes within shouting distance. Her grandfather owned several acres, and that land became the backdrop of her childhood. Open fields stretched wide under southern skies. Woods offered endless places to explore, and the dirt roads felt like they belonged to the children who ran along them. There was a kind of freedom in that upbringing that's hard to replicate. No locked gates, no constant supervision, just an unspoken trust in the environment and the people within it. Wilda and her siblings played until the sun dipped low, their laughter echoing through spaces that felt safe simply because they always had been. Family wasn't just important in Chickamauga. It was everything. And for Wilda, that belief settled deep into who she was. She wasn't just book smart, though she was that too. She had a sharpness to her thinking, a practical intelligence that showed itself in everyday decisions. The kind of person who could read a situation, understand people, and adapt quickly. From a young age, she carried a quiet determination, a sense that her life would extend beyond the boundaries of the small town she loved. Her dream was to become a doctor. It wasn't a fleeting idea or something she said just to fill silence when adults asked about her future. It was real, something she pursued with focus, with intention. After high school, she stepped into college as a pre-med student, ready to carve out a path that few around her had taken. But life, as it often does, introduced complications. A relationship, one that felt important at the time, shifted her priorities. It wasn't a dramatic derailment, not at first. Just a slow pull away from the trajectory she had set for herself. Choices made in moments that seemed small but carried weight over time. Eventually, she stepped away from college, putting that dream on hold. Still, she didn't stop moving forward. In 1983, she joined the United States Air Force, a decision that reflected both her independence and her willingness to step outside her comfort zone. It was a chance to redefine herself, to find structure and purpose in a different environment. But even that chapter was cut short. A heart condition led to a medical discharge, bringing her back to a crossroads she hadn't expected to face so soon. And so, like many people navigating their early adulthood, she made another choice. She married. It was New Year's Day, 1984. A symbolic beginning, perhaps, though no one could have predicted how it would unfold. Marriage brought stability in some ways, but it also brought responsibilities that would shape the rest of her life. More than anything, it brought children. Her son, Bradley, came first, then her daughter. Motherhood wasn't something Wilda approached halfway. It became central to her identity, not as a burden, but as a purpose. The kind of purpose that reshapes priorities without resentment. Her children weren't just part of her life. They were her life. For a while, things held together. But beneath the surface, changes were happening. Toward the end of their time living abroad, her husband had been stationed in Okinawa, Japan. Something shifted in him. It wasn't a single moment, not something easily defined. Just a gradual change in behavior, in mindset, in the way he carried himself. The kind of change that leaves you questioning what you missed, what you could have done differently. By 1988, the marriage ended. And just like that, Wilda found herself starting over. She returned to Chickamauga with her children, stepping back into the world she had once known so well. On the surface, it might have felt like a retreat, like a step backward. But in reality, it was something else entirely. It was a return to stability, to support, to a network of people who didn't need explanations or justifications, who simply showed up. Her grandparents' home became a gathering place once again, filled with familiar faces and routines that hadn't changed. It was there, in that environment, that her children began to build their own memories of family. Running through the same fields, playing in the same spaces, growing up in the same quiet safety that had shaped their mother. And it was there that certain connections reemerged. Sam Thomas was one of those constants. Wilda's uncle, a man who had always been part of the family fabric. To the children, he wasn't just an uncle. He was something closer to a figure of excitement, almost mythic in the way they anticipated his visits. They would watch for him, waiting for the moment his car appeared, the energy in the house shifting the second he arrived. He brought with him a sense of joy, of presence. The kind of adult who didn't just exist in the background but actively engaged, who made children feel seen, important. For Wilda, Sam represented something steady, reliable, a reminder that even when parts of her life had fallen apart, there were still foundations that held. But Sam wasn't the only connection tied to that part of her past. There was also Betty, and through Betty, there was Howard. Family ties in small towns often form complicated webs, relationships layered through marriages, divorces, and shared histories that don't neatly separate when things end. Howard had been part of that web, a presence during family gatherings years before, someone who had moved in and out of proximity without ever fully disappearing. Back then, he had just been another face in the crowd. Now he was something more. When he re-entered Wilda's life, it wasn't in isolation. It was within the context of everything she valued: family, children, stability. He wasn't an outsider trying to break in. He already belonged, at least in some way. And that made all the difference. Because trust in environments like this isn't always built from scratch. Sometimes it's inherited, passed along through association, through familiarity. If someone has been part of your world before, even peripherally, it becomes easier to accept them when they step closer. Howard understood that, whether consciously or not. He stepped into a space that was already open. And at the same time, he carried his own story. A story that, on the surface, mirrored Wilda's in ways that felt almost too aligned to be coincidence. He was a single parent, raising a young daughter named Kelly. He spoke of loss, of abandonment, of a woman who had left without explanation. There was pain in that narrative, but also resilience. The image of a father doing his best in difficult circumstances. It was a story that resonated, because Wilda knew what it meant to start over, to rebuild, to put children first even when everything else felt uncertain. Their worlds didn't just intersect, they reflected each other. And in that reflection, something began to take shape. Not all at once, not in a way that demanded attention. Just quietly, steadily, like roots growing beneath the surface. The setting was perfect for it. A small town where lives overlapped, where families intertwined, where the past never fully let go of the present. A place where trust came easier, where people believed in second chances because they had to, because life in a close-knit community depends on it. But that same closeness, that same trust can also create blind spots. Because when everyone feels familiar, when everything feels connected, it becomes harder to see what doesn't belong. Harder to recognize when something is off. And by the time those subtle inconsistencies begin to stand out, by the time the setting that once felt safe starts to feel uncertain, the story has already moved forward. For Wilda, Chickamauga would always be home. But it was also the place where everything began. The place where the lines between trust and deception first blurred, where the foundation of her life would slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to shift. And where the past, quiet, persistent, and unresolved, was waiting to catch up. Before the headlines, before the courtrooms and the evidence bags and the words that would later be spoken under oath, there were lives, quiet, ordinary lives, woven together by routine, by love, by the fragile hope that tomorrow would look a lot like today. And at the center of it all was Wilda Gadd, not as a witness, not as a survivor, but simply as a mother trying to build something steady in a world that had already asked a lot of her. If you had met her during those years, you wouldn't have seen anything extraordinary at first glance. She wasn't loud, didn't demand attention when she entered a room. But there was a presence about her, something grounded. The kind of person who listens more than she speaks, who notices details others miss, who carries responsibility without making a show of it. It was a quiet strength, the kind that often goes unrecognized until it's tested. And her life, in so many ways, revolved around her children. Bradley and his sister grew up in a world that, while not perfect, was filled with consistency. There were routines, school in the morning, dinner at home, evenings shaped by homework, television, or simply being together. It wasn't extravagant, but it was stable. And stability, for Wilda, wasn't just a preference. It was a promise she made to herself after her first marriage ended. She had seen what instability could do. The slow unraveling of something that once felt secure, the way uncertainty seeps into every corner of daily life. She wasn't going to let her children grow up in that kind of environment if she could help it. So she worked. Not just in the literal sense, though she did that too. Jobs that paid the bills, that kept food on the table, that made sure her kids had what they needed. But she also worked emotionally, mentally, constantly balancing, constantly adjusting, constantly making decisions that prioritized their well-being over her own comfort. It showed in the way her children spoke about her. Not with exaggerated praise, but with something more telling: trust. They relied on her. They expected her to be there, to handle things, to keep their world intact. And for the most part, she did. But even in that carefully constructed life, there were spaces, small ones, easy to overlook, where loneliness could settle in. Not the kind that overwhelms, but the kind that lingers quietly. The absence of a partner, of someone to share the weight with, to talk to at the end of the day when the house finally goes quiet. Wilda didn't chase relationships. She wasn't searching desperately for someone to fill that space. If anything, she was cautious, protective of what she had built, aware of how easily things could change. Which is why, when Howard began to move from the edges of her life into something more central, it didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like an addition. At first, it was about the children. Kelly, Howard's young daughter, entered their world almost gently. She was around 4 or 5 years old, small, quiet in the way children often are when they're adjusting to new environments. There was a softness to her, but also something else, something harder to define. A kind of clinginess, maybe. The way she stayed close, the way she seemed to attach quickly. Children adapt in different ways, especially when their lives have already been disrupted. And Kelly's life had been disrupted. Her mother, Debbie, wasn't part of the picture. The explanation, at least the one Howard gave, was simple. She had left, walked away without warning, without reason, leaving him to figure out how to raise their child alone. It was a story that carried weight, not just because of what it implied, but because of how it was told. There was a sadness to it, but also a kind of quiet dignity. Howard didn't present himself as a victim, at least not overtly. More like someone who had accepted what happened and moved forward. That mattered, because it shaped how people saw him. And more importantly, it shaped how Wilda saw him. When Kelly spent time with Wilda's children, something clicked. The barriers that might have existed dissolved quickly, replaced by something that felt natural, almost immediate. They played together, laughed together, formed connections that didn't need to be forced. At Disneyland, of all places, that connection became undeniable. The trip had been planned for Wilda and her kids, a break from routine, a chance to create memories in a place built entirely around that idea. But when the possibility of bringing Kelly along came up, it didn't feel like a complication. It felt right. And during that trip, watching the children interact, something shifted. They didn't act like separate families. They acted like one. It's easy, in moments like that, to imagine a future. To see what life could look like if things stayed the same, if the connections you're witnessing continued to grow. For Wilda, it wasn't about replacing what had been lost. It was about building something new, something that felt whole. And Howard fit into that vision. He was attentive, not just to her, but to the children. He engaged with them, joked with them, showed affection in ways that seemed genuine. There was a warmth to him, a kind of easy charm that made people feel comfortable. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't suspicious. It was exactly what you would want it to be. Which is why the transition from separate lives to a shared one didn't feel abrupt. They moved in together. Not as a grand, life-altering decision, but as the next logical step. Two single parents, both trying to provide for their children, both navigating similar challenges. Combining households made sense, practically and emotionally. And for a while, it worked. The house became a shared space, filled with the overlapping rhythms of daily life. Mornings were busy, evenings were loud. Weekends carried the kind of chaotic energy that comes with multiple children under one roof. There were moments of frustration, of course, there always are, but they were balanced by something stronger. A sense of belonging. For Wilda, it felt like she had found something she hadn't even realized she was missing. Not just a partner, but a family unit that extended beyond her and her children. Something fuller, more complete. And Howard seemed to feel the same. Their relationship deepened, shifting from companionship into something more intimate. It wasn't marked by dramatic gestures or declarations. Instead, it grew in the quiet moments, the shared responsibilities, the conversations late at night, the unspoken understanding that they were building something together. But even in those moments, even as everything appeared to be falling into place, there were details, small, almost invisible, that didn't quite align. Howard's stories about Debbie, for example, they were consistent mostly. But consistency isn't the same as truth. Sometimes, it's just repetition. And occasionally there were gaps. Questions that didn't have clear answers. Timelines that felt slightly off if you looked too closely. Wilda noticed some of it. Not in a way that set off alarms, not immediately. More like a faint unease, the kind you can push aside if you try hard enough. Because everything else, his behavior, his interactions with the children, the life they were building, seemed to contradict any darker interpretation. And people tend to trust what they can see, over what they can't. Still, the rumors existed. About Debbie's disappearance. About the possibility that she hadn't just left. About things that, if true, would have painted a very different picture of the man Wilda was growing closer to. But rumors, especially in small towns, can be cruel. They can exaggerate, distort, create narratives that have little to do with reality. And without proof, without something tangible to hold on to, they're easy to dismiss. Wilda wanted to dismiss them, not out of denial, but out of reason. Because the alternative required accepting something that didn't match her experience, didn't match the man she thought she knew. And so she focused on what was in front of her. Her children, who were happy. Kelly, who had found a place where she seemed to belong. And Howard, who, in every visible way, appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a father, a partner, a man trying to build a better life after loss. But sometimes, the most important parts of a story aren't the ones you can see clearly. They're the ones that exist just out of focus. Waiting for the moment when everything sharpens, when the pieces fall into place, when the truth, whatever it is, becomes impossible to ignore. For Wilda, that moment hadn't come yet. But it was getting closer. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single night where everything shattered, no loud, unmistakable moment that marked the beginning of the end. Instead, the change crept in slowly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to be noticed. And for a while, it wasn't. At first, life inside that house still looked the same from the outside. The routines continued. The children went to school, came home, filled the space with noise and movement. Dinner was still cooked, bills were still paid, conversations still happened across kitchen tables and living room couches. If you had driven past, if you had glanced through a window, you would have seen a family. But inside, something had shifted. It started with Howard. Not in a way that could be easily explained, not in something you could point to and say, this is where it began. More like a gradual drift, a subtle pulling away from the things that once seemed important to him. He had always worked, had always talked about providing, about building something for the future. But now his focus began to change. The long-haul trucking job became more than just work. It became distance. Trips that used to feel necessary started to feel excessive. He was gone more often than he was home, and when he was home, there was a restlessness to him. A kind of impatience, like the life he had helped build was no longer enough to hold his attention. Wilda noticed it, of course. You don't live with someone, share a space, share a life, without sensing when something is off. But noticing and understanding are two different things. And at that point, she didn't yet understand. She tried to rationalize it. Work was stressful. Money was tight. Maybe he felt pressure to provide more, to do more. Maybe the distance was temporary, something they could work through. But the truth was more complicated and darker. When the phone call came about the truck, it didn't feel like the beginning of a nightmare. It felt like a problem. Something unexpected, yes, but still within the realm of things that could be explained. The police had found their 18-wheeler abandoned on a side road in New York. Abandoned. That word hung in the air, heavy with implications. Wilda's first thought wasn't suspicion. It was concern. Where was Howard? Why wasn't he with the truck? What had happened? There were no immediate answers. And then, almost as if on cue, Howard called. He said he was at a motel, that the truck had been taken to be unloaded, that he was waiting for it to be returned. It was a simple explanation. Too simple. Because by then, the police had already told her the truth. The truck hadn't been taken anywhere. It had been sitting there, alone, untouched, for hours. The two versions of reality didn't match. And, in that moment, something cracked. Not completely, not enough to break everything apart, but enough to let doubt seep in. Enough to make her question, for the first time in a real, tangible way, whether the man she trusted was telling her the truth. When she confronted him, he adjusted the story, shifted it slightly, like someone trying to patch a hole before it becomes too obvious. The truck had been picked up, he said. It would be back soon. There had been a misunderstanding. But the words didn't land the same way anymore. Because once you see a lie, even a small one, it changes how you hear everything that comes after. The police asked to search the truck. Wilda agreed, without hesitation. Why wouldn't she? As far as she knew, there was nothing to find. Citrus fruit, maybe some paperwork, the usual remnants of a long-haul job. But what they found wasn't ordinary. It wasn't even close. 700 kilos of cocaine. The number itself felt unreal, too large to fully comprehend. This wasn't a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be explained away with a simple excuse. This was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something dangerous. And suddenly, the man she had built a life with didn't look the same. The pieces didn't fit anymore. The father who played with the kids, who laughed easily, who spoke about family and responsibility. How did that person connect to this? To drugs, to smuggling, to something so far outside the life they were living? It didn't make sense. And yet, it was real. Howard eventually turned himself in. Faced with the evidence, with the reality of the situation, he had no other choice. The charges were severe, tied to one of the largest cocaine hauls into the United States at the time. The kind of case that doesn't just disappear, that doesn't get quietly resolved. For Wilda, it was a moment of reckoning. Not just with what had happened, but with everything that led up to it. The stories, the inconsistencies, the rumors she had chosen to dismiss. They all came rushing back, no longer abstract, no longer easy to ignore. And still, even then, part of her wanted to believe him. Because he had an explanation. He always had an explanation. He said he didn't know about the drugs. That someone else had arranged it, that he had been used, set up. That he wasn't the person the evidence made him out to be. And belief, once established, doesn't disappear easily. It bends. It stretches. It looks for ways to survive, even in the face of things that should destroy it. Sam, too, struggled with it. He had always believed in Howard, had seen the best in him even when others questioned. And now, faced with something this serious, he didn't immediately turn away. He asked questions, yes. Expressed doubt. But he didn't abandon him. That loyalty would matter later. More than anyone could have anticipated. Howard made a deal. The authorities offered him a way out, or at least a way to lessen the consequences. In exchange for information, names, connections, details about where the drugs came from, he could avoid a harsher sentence. And he took it. He gave them a name, Kenneth Adams, claimed that this was the man behind it, the one who had arranged everything. Whether it was true or not, whether it was the full story or just a piece of it, didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that Howard walked away with less than he should have faced. He came home, but the man who returned wasn't the same as the one who had left. And maybe, more importantly, the life he returned to wasn't the same either. The trust that had once been there, steady and unquestioned, was fractured. Not completely broken, not yet, but damaged in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. Wilda tried to hold things together. She kept working, kept taking care of the kids, kept pushing forward in the way she always had. But the weight of everything, the arrest, the charges, the uncertainty, pressed down on her. And Howard didn't make it easier. If anything, he made it worse. Because instead of rebuilding, instead of trying to repair what had been damaged, he began to unravel further. His behavior became more erratic, more distant, more disconnected from the responsibilities he once claimed to value. And then there were the teenagers. They started appearing slowly at first. 1 or 2 friends of Kelly's spending time at the house. That wasn't unusual. Teenagers gather, they form groups, they look for places where they feel comfortable. But this was different. The numbers grew. The presence became constant. The house, once filled with the structured chaos of a family, turned into something else entirely. Sleeping bags on the floor, kids coming and going at all hours, a kind of energy that felt less like home and more like something uncontrolled. Wilda saw it. She questioned it. And when she did, Howard had answers. He always had answers. He said he was trying to connect with Kelly, that she was a teenager now, that she needed space, that allowing her to have her friends around was a way to keep her close, to keep her safe. It sounded reasonable, until it didn't. Because the truth, when it started to surface, was impossible to ignore. The drinking, the drugs, the fact that it wasn't just happening, it was being allowed, encouraged even. And suddenly, the line between father and participant blurred in a way that was deeply unsettling. For Wilda, it was a breaking point. Not a dramatic explosion, not a moment filled with shouting or confrontation. Just a quiet, devastating realization that the life she had tried to build was no longer something she could protect. Not with him in it.
So she made a choice.
She left. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because her children came first, always had, always would. And staying meant exposing them to something she couldn't control, couldn't justify. Walking away didn't solve everything. It didn't undo what had already happened, but it created distance. And sometimes, distance is the only way to see things clearly. What Wilda didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this was only the beginning. Because the chaos that had entered her life through Howard wasn't fading. It was building. And somewhere within it, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Something that would soon move beyond suspicion, beyond doubt, and into a reality that couldn't be escaped. By the time the house was gone, it no longer felt like a loss. Not in the traditional sense. There were no bittersweet memories clinging to the walls, no longing glances back at what used to be. Whatever that place had once represented, hope, stability, a future built carefully from shared effort, had already been stripped away long before the bank finalized the foreclosure. What remained at the end was something hollow, something that carried more tension than warmth, more questions than answers. Howard moved out, but he didn't move on. If anything, he sank deeper into a version of himself that felt increasingly unrecognizable. The new house in Rossville wasn't a fresh start. It was an extension of the chaos that had taken root in the previous one. The same teenagers followed him there, orbiting around him in a way that felt less like friendship and more like dependence. They weren't just visitors anymore. They lived there, existed within a space that had no clear boundaries, no real structure. And at the center of it all was Howard, not as a parent, not as a figure of authority, but as something far more troubling. He blended in. That was the unsettling part. Not that he stood apart from them, but that he seemed to want to be one of them. The lines between adult and teenager blurred until they almost disappeared. There were no clear rules, no expectations, just a constant flow of activity that felt directionless and unchecked. Wilda saw pieces of it from a distance. Even after the separation, even after she had made the decision to protect her children by leaving, she couldn't fully disconnect. Not when her past, her memories, and parts of her extended family were still tied to Howard in ways that couldn't be easily undone. And then there were the calls. In August of 2002, one of them came without warning, casual in tone but heavy in implication. Howard mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Kelly had gotten married. 16 years old. Married. Not just Kelly. 2 other teenagers as well, Adam Christmare and Samantha Lemming. All of them barely old enough to navigate high school, now suddenly bound by something as serious and life-altering as marriage. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. A grown man taking multiple teenage couples to a wedding chapel, facilitating something that should have raised immediate concerns, should have triggered intervention, should have been stopped. But instead, it happened quietly, almost invisibly, like so many other things in Howard's world. Wilda tried to understand it. Tried to find some logic, some explanation that would make it less disturbing. But the more she thought about it, the less it held together. The only conclusion that lingered, uncomfortable and persistent, was control. It felt like control. A way to keep them close. To bind them to him in ways that went beyond simple friendship or guardianship. Marriage at that age wasn't just impulsive, it was limiting. It narrowed options, created dependencies, made it harder for those teenagers to step outside the environment they were in. And that environment was Howard. By then, even Sam had begun to see it. For years, he had defended Howard, believed in him, stood by him through situations that would have caused others to walk away. But there comes a point where loyalty collides with reality, where what you see can no longer be explained away. Sam visited the house. What he found there wasn't something he could ignore. Teenagers everywhere. No structure. No sense of order. And Howard, not trying to fix it, not trying to change it, but fully immersed in it. It was enough. Enough for Sam to step back, to finally separate himself from the man he had once supported so fiercely. It wasn't dramatic. There was no public declaration, no confrontation that marked the end. Just a quiet withdrawal, a decision made internally that things had gone too far. For Wilda, that shift mattered. Sam had always been a constant, a steady presence in her life and in her children's lives. His support, his involvement, it grounded things. And now, with him distancing himself from Howard, there was a sense that maybe, finally, the truth of who Howard had become was being acknowledged. But that acknowledgement came too late, because by September, something else began to unfold. It started with absence. Sam was supposed to show up. A simple plan, nothing unusual. He had responsibilities, commitments, things he always followed through on. That was who he was. Reliable to a fault. If he said he would be there, he would be there. Except this time he wasn't. At first, it didn't feel urgent. Delays happen. Plans change. But as hours turned into days, the absence became harder to explain. Calls went unanswered. Messages left without response. And that wasn't Sam. The feeling that settled in wasn't immediate panic. It was something slower, heavier. A growing unease that didn't have a clear shape yet, but was impossible to ignore. Wilda felt it. So did the rest of the family. By Monday, it was enough. She decided to go to his house. Howard went with her. That detail would matter later, though at the time, it didn't stand out. It seemed natural, even. Despite everything that had happened, despite the separation, there was still a connection there, still a thread that hadn't been completely severed. They walked around the outside first. The house was locked. That alone wasn't unusual, but combined with everything else, it added to the tension. They tried looking through windows, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that Sam was inside, that he was simply unavailable. Nothing. So they went in. The interior felt off. Not in a dramatic way. There was no immediate sign of struggle, no overturned furniture or obvious damage. But there was a stillness, a kind of unnatural quiet that didn't match the man who lived there. They found brochures. Travel-related. Pamphlets suggesting that Sam had been planning a trip, that he might have left town intentionally. It was a convenient explanation, one that could have eased concerns if it had been supported by anything else. But it wasn't, because Sam didn't take trips. Not like that. Not without telling anyone. Not without preparing, without making arrangements, without leaving clear signs of where he was going. And then there were the details that didn't fit. His medication still in the cabinet. His belongings, things he would have taken if he were leaving for any extended period, still in place. The story the brochures tried to tell didn't match the reality of the house. And then Howard spoke. He mentioned, almost casually, that Sam had told him about buying a camper, about traveling, about being gone for a while. It was the kind of statement that could have shifted the narrative, could have provided a framework for understanding the situation. But it didn't. Because it didn't feel right. Not to Wilda. Not to anyone who knew Sam. And just like that, the unease turned into something sharper. Something closer to fear. They reported him missing. At first, the response wasn't what they expected. Sam was an adult, after all. He had the right to come and go as he pleased. There was no immediate evidence of wrongdoing, nothing that demanded urgent action from authorities. But the family knew better. They knew his habits, his routines, the way he lived his life. And this wasn't it. Days turned into a search. Fields were walked, methodically, with people spaced just feet apart, scanning the land for anything out of place. Buildings were checked, silos opened, every possible space examined with growing desperation. Inside the house, more details emerged. The overnight bag they thought was missing was found, hidden. A chair out of place. And beneath it a stain. Dark. Large. Impossible to ignore once it was seen. The room seemed to close in around that discovery, the weight of what it suggested settling heavily in the air. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was something. Something that couldn't be explained away. Something that shifted the search from hopeful to something else entirely. And still, there was no body. No confirmation. Just a growing sense that whatever had happened to Sam wasn't accidental. It wasn't voluntary. It was something done. And somewhere within that realization, a question began to take shape. Not just what happened, but who. The search for Sam didn't stop when the first fear took hold. It intensified. What began as concern had already shifted into something heavier, something that carried urgency beneath every step, every phone call, every door knocked on. The family moved with purpose now, no longer hoping for a simple explanation, but bracing for something far worse. And yet, even with that growing dread, the truth remained just out of reach. The farmland was covered inch by inch, boots pressing into dirt that had once felt familiar, now carrying a different weight. People who had known Sam for decades, neighbors, church members, extended family, joined in, forming lines that stretched across open fields, moving slowly, deliberately. They weren't just looking for a man anymore. They were looking for answers. But the land gave them nothing. Inside the house, the tension thickened. It was no longer just about what was missing. It was about what had been moved, altered, disturbed in ways that didn't make sense. The chair that had been out of place, now returned to where it belonged, revealed more than anyone wanted to see. The stain beneath it, dark and wide, wasn't something that could be ignored or explained away with accident or coincidence. It suggested violence. But still, there was no body. Without that, everything hovered in a space of uncertainty. Suspicion could grow, theories could form, but proof remained elusive. And in that gap, in that space where answers should have been, people began to look more closely at those closest to Sam. Howard. At first, he wasn't an obvious suspect, not in the way strangers or unknown figures might be. He had been there after all. He had gone with Wilda to check on Sam's house. He had walked through the same rooms, seen the same things, expressed the same confusion. But that closeness, that involvement, also meant something else. Opportunity. As the days passed, small details began to surface, each one adding a layer to a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. Sam's truck, for instance. It hadn't just disappeared, it had been found. At the Chattanooga airport. Left behind like a clue. At first glance, it might have suggested that Sam had left voluntarily, that he had driven himself there and flown somewhere else. But that theory fell apart quickly. There were no records of him boarding any flight. No tickets, no confirmations, nothing that indicated he had gone anywhere by plane. It felt staged. And then came the witness. A parking lot attendant who remembered the truck, remembered the moment it arrived. Not just the vehicle, but the people connected to it. A man driving it in. A transfer. A blue Jeep. 2 younger individuals. It wasn't a clear identification, not something that could immediately lead to an arrest. But it was enough to shift the focus, because it introduced movement. It suggested that Sam hadn't been alone, that someone else had been involved, had taken control of the situation at some point between his house and the airport. And then there was the money. In cases like this, when physical evidence is limited, investigators often follow patterns, habits, transactions, anything that leaves a trace. Sam had been careful with his finances, predictable, consistent, which made the activity on his credit card stand out immediately. Charges appearing at times and places that didn't align with his known movements. Transactions made late at night, in locations he had no reason to be. That alone was suspicious. But what came next removed any doubt. Surveillance footage. Grainy, time-stamped, impersonal, but clear enough. It showed 2 people using Sam's credit cards. Howard and Adam Christmare. Adam, the same teenager who had been living in Howard's orbit, the same one who had recently gotten married under circumstances that already felt questionable. 17 years old, now appearing in footage tied directly to a missing man's financial activity. That was the moment things changed. Suspicion turned into something stronger. The authorities could no longer dismiss the situation as a simple missing person case. There were too many inconsistencies, too many connections pointing in the same direction. They needed to talk to Howard. An interview was scheduled. October 4th. A chance to hear his side, to clarify the discrepancies, to understand how his name and Adam's had become entangled in Sam's disappearance. But Howard didn't show up. At the last minute, he postponed. October 8th. 4 days. In the context of an investigation, 4 days can mean everything. Time to prepare. Time to adjust stories. Time to act. And in those 4 days, something did happen. Something that would push the case into a direction no one had fully anticipated. It began with a letter. Unexpected, unsettling, arriving without warning. Wilda received it. The handwriting, the content, it didn't feel like a casual message. It carried urgency, a kind of desperation that bled through the words. It named names.
Adam, Samantha.
Others. It spoke of a setup, of Howard being framed for murder. The letter was from Samantha Christmare, 16 years old. One of the teenagers who had been living under Howard's influence, who had been part of that strange, controlled environment that had raised so many questions. Now, she was writing about murder. Wilda didn't keep the letter. She turned it over to the police. And that was the moment the investigation crossed a line. Up until then, there had been suspicion, evidence pointing toward wrongdoing, but nothing definitive. The letter changed that. It introduced the possibility that what had happened to Sam wasn't an isolated incident, that there was more, that other lives might already be at risk. The authorities moved quickly. They needed to find Samantha. They needed to find Adam. But they couldn't. Both were gone. No contact, no confirmed sightings, nothing to indicate where they might be or what condition they were in. The absence was deafening. Because now it wasn't just one missing person. It was 3. Howard, however, was still within reach. When October 8th came, he finally appeared for the interview. But by then, the situation had shifted again. He wasn't just a person of interest anymore. The use of Sam's credit cards had created a direct legal issue, a violation tied to his existing parole conditions. That alone was enough to hold him. So he was taken into custody. And once inside, the pressure began to build. Interviews, questioning, the slow tightening of a net that had been forming for weeks. But Howard didn't break in the way investigators might have expected. Not immediately. Instead, it was something else that moved the case forward. Something quieter. Phone calls. From jail, Howard had limited access to the outside world, but what access he did have was monitored. Every conversation recorded, every word analyzed for meaning. One call in particular stood out. His mother, Betty. Their conversation wasn't direct. It didn't contain clear admissions or explicit instructions. Instead, it was coded, fragmented, the kind of exchange where meaning hides between words. They talked about furniture, about moving things, about a storage unit. It might have gone unnoticed if not for the tension in Howard's voice, the way he cut her off, the urgency behind his interruption. She had said just enough. Enough for investigators to act. They began calling storage facilities, searching records, looking for anything tied to Betty. And they found it. A unit in Johnson City, Tennessee. From the outside, it looked ordinary, like any other storage space, locked, unremarkable. But there was something else. A smell. Faint, but unmistakable. The kind of smell that doesn't belong in places like that. The kind that signals something is very, very wrong. What they found inside would change everything. But at that moment, standing outside that unit, with only the first hints of what waited behind the door, the investigation was no longer about finding a missing man. It was about uncovering something far more disturbing. Something that had been hidden carefully. Something that was about to come into the light. The door to the storage unit didn't resist when it was opened, but everything else did. The air itself felt heavy, thick with something that didn't belong in a place meant for forgotten furniture and boxed-up memories. It was the kind of smell that settles into the back of your throat before your mind fully registers it, a quiet warning that what you're about to see cannot be undone. Inside, there were containers. Large, industrial, the kind used for storage, for transport. Ordinary in appearance. Unremarkable if you didn't know what you were looking for. But investigators knew. They had already felt it in the air, in the tension that had followed them from the moment Betty's name surfaced in that phone call. When the lids came off, the case changed forever. 2 bodies. Not whole. Not intact. Reduced in ways that spoke of time, of effort, of something methodical and deliberate. Adam Christmare. Samantha Lemming. Teenagers who had once filled a house with noise and restless energy, now silent, hidden away in a space no one would think to look unless they knew exactly where to search. The brutality of it wasn't just in the act itself, but in the aftermath. The way they had been handled, the attempt to erase identity, to remove pieces that made them recognizable, to turn people into something untraceable. It didn't work, because even in that condition, even after everything that had been done, the truth remained. They had been killed. And now, the investigation had something it hadn't had before. Proof. But proof alone doesn't tell the whole story. It raises new questions, shifts the focus, demands explanations that go deeper than what is immediately visible. And in this case, the questions multiplied quickly. Where had the murders taken place? Who had been involved? And perhaps most importantly, what had happened to Sam? Because even with 2 victims found, one was still missing. And the connection between all 3 wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was woven into every piece of evidence, every timeline, every decision that had been made in those critical days. Howard was already in custody. But until that moment, the authorities didn't know how much he would reveal, how far his involvement went, or whether he would speak at all. They needed more. And that's where Wilda came back into the picture. Up until then, she had been on the edges of the investigation, connected, involved, but not directly part of it. Now that changed. The discovery in the storage unit forced investigators to reconsider every relationship, every connection, every person who had been close enough to potentially know something. They weren't sure where she stood. Witness or suspect. Those lines can blur in cases like this, especially when the web of relationships is as tight and complicated as this one. But there was something they did know. Howard trusted her. Or at least he had. And that trust could be used. When they approached her, they didn't lay everything out. They didn't tell her about the bodies, didn't reveal the full extent of what had been discovered. Instead, they asked for help. A conversation. A visit. A chance to hear what Howard might say if he believed he was speaking to someone still on his side. It wasn't an easy decision, because agreeing meant stepping into something dangerous. Not physically, not in the immediate sense, but emotionally, psychologically. It meant sitting across from a man she had once loved, a man she had built a life with, and pretending, at least for a moment, that nothing had changed. It meant risking what he might say, and what it might confirm. But Wilda agreed. They prepared her carefully. A wire hidden beneath her clothing. Instructions on what to do, what to say, how to keep the conversation moving without pushing too hard. It wasn't about interrogation. It was about listening. When she entered the jail, the space felt different from anything she had known before. Controlled. Confined. The kind of place where time stretches and compresses at the same time, where every sound echoes a little too sharply. Howard was brought in, and the moment he saw her, something shifted. Not relief. Not surprise. Something else. His first words didn't ease into conversation. They didn't ask questions or offer explanations. They cut straight through everything. You're too late. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight of it was enough. Wilda felt it before she understood it. And then he said it again, more clearly this time. He told her what he had done. Not in a way that suggested hesitation or regret, but in a tone that felt disturbingly matter-of-fact. As if he were explaining something that had already been accepted, something that no longer needed to be hidden. He talked about the shootings. About Adam. About Samantha. About what came after. The dismemberment. The reasoning. He framed it in a way that almost tried to justify it, to give it a sense of twisted logic. Said that Adam had done the same thing to Sam, that what he had done was, in some way, an act of balance. But it didn't make sense. Not in the way he presented it. Because if Adam had been responsible for Sam, then why were Adam and Samantha the ones found in pieces, hidden away, reduced to evidence? The story didn't hold. And even as he spoke, even as the words came out, it became clear that this wasn't the full truth. Just a version of it. Wilda listened. She had to. Every instinct, every emotion had to be held back, controlled, suppressed in that moment. Because what mattered wasn't how she felt. It was what he revealed. So she asked, carefully, about Sam, where he was, what had happened. Howard didn't want to focus on that. He redirected, shifted the conversation back to himself, to what he needed, to what he wanted her to do. There was a sense of urgency in it, a desire to control the narrative even now, even from inside a jail cell. But she kept pressing. Not aggressively, not in a way that would shut him down, but enough to keep the question present. And eventually he gave something, not everything, but enough. Directions. Fragments of location. References that investigators could follow. Outside, the detectives didn't need more. They had heard enough. The recording captured everything, the admissions, the details, the pieces that connected the bodies in the storage unit to the man sitting across from Wilda. And within minutes of the conversation ending, they moved. Howard was formally charged. But the night wasn't over. There was one more step, one more piece that needed to fall into place. The call. From a payphone, under the direction of the police, Wilda reached out to Betty and another family member, passing along what Howard had said. It wasn't just about informing them. It was about listening. And what came back was immediate. Not shock. Not denial. Instructions. Destroy the tape. The words came too quickly, too directly, as if the priority wasn't understanding what had happened, but covering it up. And in that moment, any doubt about their involvement disappeared. They were arrested soon after. Everything was moving now. Fast. But even with arrests, even with confessions, there was still one thing missing. Sam. The directions Howard had given were followed immediately. Officers moved out, tracing the path he had described, narrowing in on a location that matched his fragmented instructions. It didn't take long. Less than 30 minutes. That was all it took to find him. Not alive. Not waiting. But there. Hidden like the others had been. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The missing man. The bodies in the storage unit. The lies, the rumors, the inconsistencies that had built up over time. They all connected. What had started as a quiet disappearance in a small town had become something far larger, far darker than anyone had imagined. And at the center of it all was the man Wilda had once trusted. The man who had stood beside her, built a life with her, shared her home, her family. Now revealed piece by piece for who he really was. The courtroom didn't feel like a place for truth. It felt like a place where truth had to fight to be heard, where it had to be pieced together, translated into language that could fit within legal boundaries, measured against standards that demanded proof beyond emotion, beyond instinct, beyond what everyone already felt in their bones. By the time the trial began, years had passed. Time had stretched the case into something almost surreal. Memories had to be revisited, details recalled with precision, pain reopened in ways that never fully heal. For the families, for the few who had lived through it closely, the wait had been its own kind of punishment. Justice delayed doesn't feel like justice. It feels like something unfinished, something constantly looming. Howard sat at the center of it all. Not the man people once described as charming or attentive, not the figure who blended into family gatherings or played the role of a father. That version of him felt distant now, almost like a story told about someone else. What remained was quieter, more controlled. He didn't erupt, didn't lash out. If anything, he seemed composed, as though the gravity of the situation existed somewhere outside of him. That composure didn't help him, because the case against him didn't rely on speculation anymore. It didn't hinge on rumors or assumptions. It was built on evidence that had been gathered piece by piece, each element reinforcing the next until the structure was solid enough to stand on its own. The prosecution didn't rush. They couldn't. Cases like this require patience, a careful unfolding of facts that allows a jury to see not just what happened, but how it happened, why it happened, and who is responsible. They began with the timeline, reconstructing the days leading up to the disappearances, the movements that had once seemed disconnected but now formed a clear pattern. Sam's absence, the use of his credit cards, the footage showing Howard and Adam, the storage unit. Each detail was presented not as an isolated fact, but as part of a larger narrative, one that pointed consistently in the same direction. And then came the recording. Wilda's voice, steady but carrying an undercurrent of something heavier, something that couldn't be fully hidden. Howard's voice, unmistakable, delivering words that no defense could easily dismantle. He didn't deny it. That was the most striking part. There was no dramatic confession in the courtroom, no moment where he stood and admitted everything in front of the jury. That had already happened, quietly, in a jailhouse conversation he believed was private. What the jury heard wasn't performance. It was raw, unfiltered, spoken without the awareness of consequences. He talked about the killings, about Adam, about Samantha, about the acts that followed. The defense had little room to maneuver. They could question the context, suggest coercion, argue that the statements were misinterpreted or incomplete. But the clarity of the recording made those arguments difficult to sustain. The words were direct. The intent behind them was hard to reframe. And beyond the recording, there was the physical evidence. The condition of the bodies. The efforts made to conceal them. The connections to the storage unit rented by his own mother. It painted a picture that wasn't just about guilt, but about calculation. This wasn't a crime committed in a moment of uncontrollable rage. It wasn't something that spiraled out of a single bad decision. It involved steps taken after the fact. Actions meant to hide, to obscure, to delay discovery. That mattered, because it spoke to intent, to awareness, to a level of control that contradicted any attempt to frame the situation as accidental or impulsive. For Wilda, sitting in that courtroom wasn't just about watching a trial unfold. It was about confronting a reality she had once refused to see. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every image presented brought her face to face with the man she had known, and the man he truly was. Those two versions didn't align, and yet they were the same person. That contradiction is something the legal system doesn't address. It deals in facts, in actions and outcomes. It doesn't account for the emotional complexity of realizing that someone you trusted, someone you loved, is capable of something this extreme. But for her, that was the real weight of the trial. Not just what he had done, but who he had been to her. The jury didn't have that burden. They had a different responsibility. To listen, to evaluate, to decide based on what was presented, not on personal connection or history. And over the course of the trial, the evidence gave them little room for doubt. It didn't take long. Less than 2 days. That was all the time they needed to reach a verdict.
Guilty.
First-degree murder. The words carried finality, a sense of closure that the case had been moving toward from the moment the storage unit was opened. But closure, in cases like this, is complicated. It doesn't undo what has been done. It doesn't restore what has been lost. It simply marks an end point. The sentencing followed.
Death. Not once, but twice.
For Adam. For Samantha. 2 lives taken, 2 sentences delivered in response. The severity of it reflected the brutality of the crimes, the calculated nature of what had been done. It was the highest punishment the system could impose, a statement that what had occurred fell beyond the boundaries of what society could accept. Howard received it without visible reaction. No outburst. No visible remorse. Just the same controlled demeanor that had followed him throughout the trial. For some, that absence of emotion was as unsettling as anything else, because it suggested something deeper, something that went beyond the actions themselves. But even as the verdict was delivered, even as the sentence was imposed, there was an unresolved piece lingering in the background.
Sam.
His body had been found, his death confirmed, but his case would never be tried in the same way. The conviction for Adam and Samantha effectively closed the door on a separate trial for Sam's murder. The legal system had already imposed its highest penalty. There was no practical need to pursue another sentence that could not exceed what had already been given. And so, in a formal sense, that part of the story remained incomplete. There would be no separate courtroom moment where his name was the sole focus, where his case was laid out in full, where every detail of what happened to him was examined under the same scrutiny. For his family, that absence mattered. Because justice, while technically served, didn't feel fully realized. And then there was Debbie. Still missing. Still officially unaccounted for. The rumors that had once seemed distant, almost speculative, now carried a different weight. In light of everything that had been uncovered, everything that had been proven, it was impossible to ignore the possibility that her story was connected in ways that had never been fully explored. But without a body, without definitive evidence, her case remained open, unresolved, a shadow lingering at the edge of everything else. The trial had answered many questions, but not all of them. And in that space, between what was known and what would never be confirmed, the story continued to echo, long after the courtroom emptied and the verdict was recorded. Because justice, even when delivered, doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just brings silence. When the courtroom finally emptied and the last echo of the verdict faded into silence, what remained was not relief in the way people often imagine it. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt lighter, no clean break between the past and whatever came next. Instead, there was a quiet, complicated stillness, a kind of emotional aftermath that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in slowly, becoming part of everyday life. For Wilda, moving forward wasn't a single decision. It was a series of small ones, made day after day, often without certainty. The trial had drawn a line under the events, had given them structure and conclusion in a legal sense. But life doesn't operate on verdicts. It doesn't offer closure in neat, defined moments. It asks you to keep going. And that's what she did. But the weight of what had happened didn't disappear. It lingered in ways that were both obvious and subtle. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and memories had space to surface. In the unexpected triggers, a sound, a place, a conversation, that pulled her back into fragments of the past she couldn't fully escape. Because this wasn't just a story she had witnessed. It was a life she had lived. She had shared a home with Howard, built a future with him, trusted him with her children. That reality doesn't vanish just because the truth comes out. If anything, it becomes harder to process. The mind searches for explanations, for signs that were missed, for moments that could have changed the outcome if only they had been understood differently. It's a question that lingers, often without an answer. How much did I not see? And the truth is, sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. Not because of failure or weakness, but because people are capable of presenting themselves in ways that don't match who they are beneath the surface. Howard had been charming, attentive, convincing in all the ways that matter when you're building a relationship. The warning signs, when they appeared, didn't come all at once. They came in pieces, scattered across time, easy to dismiss when viewed individually. It's only in hindsight that they form a pattern. Wilda understood that. And over time, that understanding became something she chose to share. Not as a confession, not as an attempt to explain away what had happened, but as a way to reach others who might find themselves in similar situations. Because the most unsettling part of her story isn't just the crimes themselves, it's how ordinary everything seemed before the truth came out. How normal it felt. That's what makes it dangerous. Because people don't expect something like this to enter their lives. They don't expect the person sitting across from them at the dinner table, the person they trust, the person they believe they know, to be capable of something so extreme. And when small doubts appear, when something feels slightly off, it's easier to push them aside than to confront what they might mean. Wilda had done that, not out of ignorance, but out of trust, out of a desire to believe in the life she was building. And that's something she would later speak about openly, the importance of listening to those instincts, of paying attention to the details that don't quite fit, even when everything else seems right. Because sometimes, those details matter more than anything else. Life eventually found a new rhythm. It had to. Her children grew, moving through the stages of their own lives, carrying with them the impact of everything they had experienced. Trauma doesn't disappear, but it changes shape over time. It becomes something that can be managed, something that exists alongside other parts of life, rather than consuming it entirely. Wilda rebuilt, not in the sense of replacing what was lost, but in creating something new. A different kind of stability, one that wasn't tied to the past but informed by it. She remarried, found love again. Not the same as before, not built on the same assumptions, but something grounded in a deeper understanding of what matters. Trust for her didn't come as easily, but it came more carefully, more deliberately. And in that there was strength. The story didn't end with the trial.
Not really.
Because there were still unanswered questions. Sam's death, though confirmed, never received its own full examination in court. The details of what happened to him, the exact sequence of events, remained partially obscured by the larger case that had already secured the highest possible sentence. For his family, that absence left a gap, a sense that part of his story had been acknowledged but not fully told. And then there was Debbie. Her name lingered like an echo from the beginning, a question that had never been resolved. Officially, she was still missing. But in the shadow of everything that had been uncovered, it was difficult to believe that her disappearance was unrelated, that it existed in isolation from the pattern that had emerged. Without evidence, without confirmation, her case remained open, unfinished. A reminder that not every story reaches a clear conclusion. There were also others who never faced full accountability. Betty, Howard's mother, had been drawn into the investigation, her involvement hinted at through conversations, through actions that suggested more than simple ignorance. But she died before she could be tried, taking with her whatever truth she might have revealed. Or perhaps not. Because even her death carried uncertainty. Rumors persisted, quiet but persistent, that she hadn't died at all. That she had disappeared in a way that mirrored the stories surrounding her son. There was no clear confirmation, no definitive closure. Just another question left unanswered. For many, that lack of resolution is unsettling. But for Wilda, it became something she learned to live with. Because waiting for every answer, for every piece to fall perfectly into place, isn't always possible. Sometimes, moving forward means accepting that parts of the past will remain incomplete. That not everything can be explained. What mattered more was what she did with what remained. She chose not to let it define her. Not completely. There's a line she speaks about, one that captures the essence of everything she went through, everything she learned. That no matter how well you think you know someone, you don't truly know who they are. It's not meant to inspire fear. It's meant to encourage awareness. To remind people that trust should be balanced with attention, that love doesn't require blindness, that it's possible to care deeply for someone while still paying attention to the parts of them that don't make sense. because ignoring those parts doesn't make them disappear. It just delays the moment when they can no longer be ignored. In the end, Wilda's story isn't just about crime. It's about survival, about the quiet, difficult process of rebuilding after something unimaginable has torn through your life, about the choices that come after, the ones that determine whether you remain trapped in what happened or find a way to move beyond it. She chose to move forward, not perfectly, not without scars, but with intention. And in that choice, there is something powerful. Because while the past can shape you, it doesn't have to own you. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is continue living in spite of everything that tried to break them. If there's a moment when a story like this truly ends, it doesn't happen in a courtroom, and it doesn't arrive with a verdict. It happens much later, in quieter places, in ordinary moments that don't feel like milestones at all. It happens when the weight of the past no longer dictates every decision, when memories stop feeling like open wounds and begin to settle into something more distant, still present, but no longer in control. For Wilda, that moment didn't come all at once. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly, over years. In the beginning, everything carried echoes. The smallest things could pull her back, familiar roads, certain phrases, even silence itself. There's a particular kind of silence that follows trauma, one that feels heavier than noise, because it leaves too much space for thoughts to surface. And in that space, questions return. Not the kind that can be answered, but the kind that circle endlessly. Why didn't I see it sooner? What would have happened if I had? Could any of it have been stopped? These are the questions that don't fade easily because they aren't rooted in logic. They're rooted in hindsight, in the painful clarity that only comes after everything has already unfolded. Over time, though, those questions began to lose their grip. Not because they were resolved, but because life demanded something else. Presence. Wilda still had her children. She still had a future that needed to be lived, not just remembered. And slowly, step by step, she began to shift her focus away from what couldn't be changed and toward what still could. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. There were setbacks, moments when the past felt too close, when it seemed easier to retreat into memory than to push forward. But she didn't stay there. She couldn't, because she had already survived the worst of it. And survival, in itself, creates a kind of momentum. Eventually, that momentum led her to something she hadn't expected to find again. Love. Not the same kind she had known before. Not built on the same assumptions or the same sense of certainty. This time, it was different, quieter, more grounded, shaped by everything she had learned. Trust came more slowly. It had to. But when it came, it was stronger for it. More deliberate. Less about believing blindly and more about understanding deeply. She remarried. And this time, the life she built wasn't about recreating what she had lost. It was about creating something new, something that acknowledged the past without being defined by it. There's a difference between moving on and moving forward. Moving on suggests leaving everything behind, as if it never happened. Moving forward means carrying it with you, but not letting it control where you go. Wilda chose the second. Her story didn't disappear. In fact, she chose to tell it. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. There's a responsibility that comes with surviving something like this, a realization that what you've experienced could help someone else, could make them pause, question, pay attention to things they might otherwise ignore. She understood how easily it can happen. How someone can enter your life, fit into your world, become part of your family, all while hiding something you can't yet see. How warning signs don't always look like warnings. How they can be subtle, almost invisible, especially when you don't want to believe what they might mean. And that's the part she speaks about the most. Not the violence, not the courtroom, but the moments before. The ones that seem ordinary at the time. Because that's where everything begins. There's a tendency, when looking at stories like this from the outside, to focus on the extremes. The crimes, the revelations, the shocking details that feel distant from everyday life. But Wilda's experience challenges that distance. It reminds us that these things don't always start in darkness. They start in familiarity, in trust, in relationships that feel real and meaningful. That's what makes them so dangerous. And that's why awareness matters. Not paranoia, not fear of everyone around you, but awareness. The willingness to notice when something doesn't add up, to question gently but persistently, to listen to instincts that don't always have clear explanations. Because those instincts exist for a reason. They're not always right, but they're rarely meaningless. As the years passed, the sharp edges of the past softened. Not completely. There are things that don't fully heal, experiences that leave marks that never entirely fade. But those marks don't have to define everything. They can exist alongside joy, alongside new memories, alongside a life that continues to grow. Wilda became a grandmother, and in that role, there was something profoundly healing. Watching a new generation grow, seeing her children become parents themselves, experiencing moments of happiness that felt untainted by what had come before. It didn't erase the past, but it added to it. It created balance. And in that balance, there was peace, not perfect, not constant, but real. Still, some questions remain. They always will. Debbie's disappearance was never solved. Officially, she is still missing, her story left incomplete, her fate unconfirmed. But in the context of everything that was uncovered, everything that was proven, it's difficult to believe that her case exists in isolation. She is part of the story, even if her chapter was never fully written. And then there's the lingering uncertainty around others who are connected to the case, people whose roles were never fully explored, whose involvement was hinted at but never definitively established. Time has a way of closing doors, of making certain truths harder to reach. Some answers are simply lost. That's one of the hardest things to accept. That not everything will be known. That some parts of the past will remain unresolved, no matter how much time passes. But acceptance doesn't mean indifference. It means understanding the limits of what can be changed. And choosing to live anyway. If there's a message in all of this, it isn't simple. It doesn't fit neatly into a single sentence or a clear conclusion. But it exists. In the way Wilda rebuilt her life. In the way she chose to speak about her experiences, not with bitterness, but with clarity. In the way she refused to let what happened define everything that came after. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about what was done. It's a story about what comes after. About resilience. About the quiet, often invisible work of putting a life back together piece by piece. And about the truth that even after the darkest chapters, there is still a future waiting to be written. Not perfect, not untouched, but real. And sometimes that's enough. There is something unsettling about how ordinary everything looked in the beginning. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quiet, almost forgettable details that make up daily life. A driveway with tire tracks fading into dust. A front porch where conversations drifted into the evening air. The hum of insects at dusk, the kind you stop noticing after a while, because they've always been there. Nothing about it suggested that this place, this life, would one day be picked apart in courtrooms and police reports, reduced to evidence and timelines. If you had stood there back then, you wouldn't have seen danger. You would have seen a family. Wilda moved through those early days with a kind of certainty that only comes when life feels aligned. Not perfect, not without challenges, but stable in a way that feels earned. She had already faced setbacks, relationships that didn't last, plans that had to be abandoned, the quiet disappointment of dreams that shifted direction before they could fully take shape. But she had built something anyway. A life centered around her children, around the idea that no matter what else happened, they would be safe, they would be loved. That mattered more than anything. And when Howard stepped into that world, he didn't feel like a disruption. He felt like a continuation. He understood the language of family, or at least he spoke it fluently enough that no one questioned it. He laughed easily, the kind of laugh that fills space without demanding attention. He was present in a way that felt reassuring, stepping into routines without resistance, adapting to the rhythms of a household that had already been established long before he arrived. It didn't feel forced. It felt natural. That's what made it believable. The children accepted him in their own way, cautiously at first, the way kids often do when someone new enters their lives. But he didn't push. He didn't demand their trust. He let it develop slowly, through shared moments that didn't feel like attempts to win them over, but simply parts of daily life. Over time, the distance closed. And once it did, it was easy to believe that everything was exactly what it seemed. But beneath that surface, there were things that didn't quite fit. Not enough to raise alarms. Not enough to change anything. Just small inconsistencies, moments that passed quickly, leaving behind only the faintest impression that something had been slightly off. A story that didn't line up perfectly. A detail that shifted when it was repeated. A reaction that felt just a little too controlled. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they still didn't form anything concrete. So they were ignored. Because that's what people do when everything else feels right. They prioritize the bigger picture. And the bigger picture at the time looked good. But the truth is, the early chapters of a story like this rarely reveal themselves clearly. They don't announce what's coming. They don't provide obvious warnings or unmistakable signs. Instead, they unfold quietly, almost invisibly, blending into the background until it's too late to separate them from everything else. Looking back, it's easy to isolate those moments, to point to them and say that's where it started, that's where something could have been different. But in real time, it doesn't feel that way. In real time, it feels like life. Wilda's world expanded around the idea of stability, of building something lasting not just for herself, but for her children. The routines became familiar, the days predictable in a way that felt comforting rather than limiting. There's a kind of peace in knowing what tomorrow will look like, in believing that the structure you've created will hold. And for a while it did. But stability can be deceptive. It can create a sense of security that makes it harder to question what lies beneath. It can make the idea of disruption feel so unlikely that even when something doesn't quite fit, it's easier to adjust your perception than to confront the possibility that something is wrong. That's where the danger begins. Not in chaos, but in comfort. Because comfort lowers defenses. It encourages trust. And trust, when misplaced, doesn't just fail. It opens the door for everything that follows. Howard understood that. Whether consciously or instinctively, he moved within that space with ease. He adapted, adjusted, became what he needed to be in order to fit seamlessly into the life around him. There was no single moment where his behavior shifted dramatically, no clear turning point that marked the beginning of something darker. Instead, there was a gradual change. Subtle. Almost unnoticeable. Until it wasn't. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, altering the dynamics of the household in ways that were difficult to define. Priorities changed, though not in ways that could be easily articulated. The sense of unity that had once felt so natural began to feel slightly strained, as though something invisible was pulling at it from the edges. But even then, it didn't feel like a crisis. It felt like adjustment, like the kind of changes every family goes through. And that's what made it easy to accept. Because nothing about it seemed extreme enough to demand immediate attention. Nothing, at least, on the surface. But beneath that surface, the foundation was already shifting. The cracks were there. They just hadn't widened enough to be seen clearly. And by the time they did, the situation had already moved beyond the point where small corrections could make a difference. That's the part that lingers. Not just what happened, but how it happened. How something that seemed so stable, so grounded in something real, could unravel in ways that no one fully anticipated. How the signs were there, scattered across time, waiting to be recognized, but never quite forming a complete picture until it was too late. It raises uncomfortable questions. Not just about one person's actions, but about perception itself. About how we interpret the people around us. About how much we rely on what we see versus what we sense. And about the moments we choose to overlook because acknowledging them would require us to reconsider everything else. Wilda would spend years thinking about those moments. Not obsessively, not in a way that consumed her, but in a reflective way that comes with distance. She would revisit them, examine them from different angles, trying to understand not just what happened, but why it hadn't been clear at the time. The answers weren't simple. They never are. But they pointed to something important. That trust, while essential, should never come at the expense of awareness. That love, while powerful, doesn't replace the need to pay attention. And that sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones that look the most ordinary, because they don't give you a reason to question them until it's too late. In the end, the story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with normalcy, with everyday moments that feel safe, predictable, real. And it's only in retrospect that those moments take on a different meaning, that they become the opening lines of something far more complex than anyone could have imagined. That's what makes this story linger. Not just the crimes, not just the investigation, not even the trial, but the realization that it all started in a place that felt like home. In the end, what remains is not the violence itself, not the headlines or the courtroom verdicts, but the echoes left behind in the lives of those who had to keep going. Stories like this don't truly conclude. They disperse, settling into memory, into habits, into the quiet ways people change after they've seen something they can never unsee. For Wilda, the world never returned to what it was. It couldn't. There is a version of life that exists before you understand what someone is capable of, and another that comes after. The difference between the two is not just knowledge, it is perception. Once that boundary is crossed, everything is filtered through a different lens. Trust becomes something you examine, not something you give freely. Familiarity no longer guarantees safety. And the idea of truly knowing another person becomes far more complicated than it once seemed. But complexity does not have to mean fear. That is something she learned slowly over time. Because there is a danger in letting a story like this redefine everything. In allowing one person's actions to reshape how you see the entire world. It would be easy to retreat into suspicion, to question every intention, to assume that darkness hides behind every ordinary face. But that isn't the lesson she chose to carry. Instead, she learned to balance awareness with openness. To recognize that while people are capable of deception, they are also capable of honesty, of kindness, of love that is real and steady and true. The challenge is not to close yourself off, but to remain present, to observe, to listen, to trust, but not blindly. That distinction matters, because it allows life to continue. Wilda's story became something more than just a personal experience. It became a message, one that she didn't set out to deliver but found herself sharing anyway. Not because she wanted to relive what had happened, but because she understood that silence helps no one. There are others who live in situations that feel almost right, where something is just slightly off but not enough to justify concern. Others who ignore small inconsistencies because everything else seems to fit. Others who believe that love alone is enough to make things safe. She had believed that once. And she knew how easy it was. That's why she speaks. Not to frighten, not to accuse, but to remind. To remind people that paying attention is not the same as being paranoid. That asking questions is not the same as breaking trust. That intuition, even when it doesn't come with clear evidence, deserves to be acknowledged. Because sometimes, it is the only warning you get. The passage of time has a way of reshaping even the darkest experiences. It doesn't erase them, but it changes how they exist within you. What once felt overwhelming becomes something you can hold without being consumed. What once defined every moment becomes one part of a much larger life. Wilda reached that place. Not quickly, not without struggle, but she reached it. She found joy again, in places she hadn't expected. In the laughter of her grandchildren, in the quiet routines of a life rebuilt, in the simple comfort of knowing that the worst was behind her. These moments didn't replace what had been lost, but they added to what remained, creating something fuller, something that allowed her to move forward without forgetting. And that balance between remembering and living is where healing truly begins. There are still unanswered questions. There always will be. Debbie's disappearance remains a shadow that was never fully illuminated. Her story lingers at the edge of everything else, a reminder that not every truth is uncovered, not every ending is clearly defined. In another world, in a different timeline, perhaps her fate would have been discovered sooner, perhaps lives would have been saved. But reality doesn't offer those revisions. It moves in one direction, forward. And sometimes, forward means accepting that some things will remain incomplete. That justice, while powerful, has limits. That closure is not always something that arrives fully formed. It is something you build for yourself, piece by piece, through acceptance, through resilience, through the decision to continue living despite the absence of answers. If there is a final truth in the story, it is not about the crimes. It is about what survives them, the strength it takes to rebuild, the courage it takes to face what you once trusted and see it clearly for what it was. The determination to not let that truth define the rest of your life. Wilda's journey is not one of perfection. It is one of persistence, of choosing, again and again, to move forward even when the past remains close, of understanding that while you cannot control what others do, you can control how you respond, how you rebuild, how you continue. And perhaps most importantly, of recognizing that even after the darkest chapters, life does not end. It changes. It deepens. It becomes something different than what you once imagined. But within that difference, there is still meaning, still connection, still the possibility of something good. Because in the end, the story is not just about what was taken. It is about what remains. And what remains is a life that, despite everything, continues.